their grandfather. Schedules moved around and changed, and Marvine came back across the water for a temporary stay. The time she came back to care for her grandfather, both her mother and her grandfather made transition within weeks of each other. In 1975, she sat next to her mother, and her mother's last words as she turned to her said, "Marvine, the beach. Marvine, the beach," she whispered. Marvine listened as we do to our elders and took those words to her heart, her spirit, and she remained in Jacksonville. Going through that transition of being a diva in Europe, going through the transition of understanding where she had come from in Europe, being an opera singer, doing Salome, Madame Butterfly, understanding the rich life and legacy that the Lewis children had, and the grandchildren. A.L. Lewis was one of 2 millionaires in Jacksonville, but he was the first. A.L. Lewis was able to provide a lot for his family, but there was a family that he had, and those were the black folk of Jacksonville, Florida. He was one of the 7 men, as you know the story. He was one of those 7 men who helped to save the company, but it was all about family. Marvine stayed here and kind of understanding what her life had been and is. She stayed in the basement for a while of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company. She was able to, Councilwoman, she was able to gather artifacts and some histories of the Afro. Marvine then gathered her history, her spirit, her chutzpah, her eccentric kinds of ways of presenting, because, as she said, how else can I look like this and act like this if not for being an opposite? She came to the beach. If you're here, you know that story. How she came here after this beach that had a heyday from 1935 until Dora came knocking on the door, 62. When this beach opened, it opened because, as I tell my grandchildren, you know the small history that now being in this state, they will never tell you in a book about the segregationists that forced water fountains. Y'all know about that. You've heard of white only, black only bathrooms. You've heard of sitting on back of buses. You've probably heard that we couldn't even get a library book out. But back to your ages, if you're over 40, you know that and you experience that either by yourself or your ancestors. But what y'all don't know, that we don't teach our kids, it wasn't just the water out of a water fountain. It was God's water. We could not even be on a beach. In Jacksonville Beach, that today is Jacksonville Beach, at the time it was San Pablo Beach. There was an ordinance that said, no white person can be within 500 yards from any colored person. No colored person could be within 500 yards of any white person. If you violate it, you'll be fined or in prison. We're talking about beach. And we're not supposed to teach our kids. Time come and time go, the beach was here. Franklintown was here. Because in January of 1865, there was a bill that said all land from Charleston down to Florida, 400,000 miles of area, of inland about 40 miles, but all the way down. It just weaved itself. That this land had to be divided to the enslaved people. If they came in groups, it would be 40 acres. This did happen. This did happen. Hence 40 acres and a mule, but it happened only from January until Abraham Lincoln died. And those Confederates took their land back. But there is here the Harrison plantation that gave land to its enslaved people. There was one particular gentleman who was out front during the time, and his name was Franklin E., last name Town, hence the name Franklintown. The people of Jacksonville, particularly A.L. Lewis, knew of this area. A.L. Lewis was brilliant. He was brilliant in so many ways. Yes, in business. Yes, his humanitarian sense. But he was so way ahead of himself about understanding how to keep people together, productive, not only the employees of the Afro, it has to do with the family. If the family doesn't support the employee, the business goes down. If the family's not happy, the employee isn't happy. The production goes down instead of up. So he began a program of taking the employees from Jacksonville, bringing them to Franklintown. There were other people in Jacksonville who would come up here. It was not the pristine where you see the old Amelia Island plantation where it was and the Omni. It wasn't. It was the crude area that these people began farming. But they had God's ocean that they could freely move and have fun. A.L. Lewis did this for years, saw land available. That is why we are here. He bought the first 33 acres so that the people who were working for the Afro could now come to a place of their own. The company the Pension Bureau brought that in 1935. The second year they acquired 100 more acres. So now we are in a space where they began to build houses. But the economic development was mind-boggling. There was A.L. Lewis's house, and there was, 1, 2, 3, 4 houses coming up. But everybody in Jacksonville wanted to come to American Beach because A.L. Lewis probably said, we are just as American as anyone else. American Beach. The economic development was my people can have rest and relaxation without humiliation. But when you come, there was nothing but the sand and the ocean. But we had to have things to have recreation. So the company built pavilions and invited, as we call them now, vendors, small business people. If you didn't have a bathing suit in the town, you can come up here and you can rent one. If you needed to shower to take that sand off of your body, you have another place there. Or if you wanted to lay your head down, we got some place for you too. If you get hungry, there's a place for you to eat. So the business grew and grew from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, until I said, Dora. Starting to rain. But that's okay. We'll unveil it if it rains, and then when you get out in your car, you're going. So I will stop, just wanted to give you the base. A.L. Lewis and Marvin coming years later to preserve the history. What family does, as I opened with Carlton's family and my family, what family does is teach history and legacy. What family does, after years, can have the the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren return for purpose, for meaning, for legacy, for history. And it is not just Lewis's, it is for us. It is for all people to understand what living on this land is about. It's about history, it's about legacy, it's about sharing, and most of all, understanding. We know that it has not been equity. We know that we're moving towards understanding. Equity comes one piece at a time. So we have come here for the renaming of the American Beach Museum to the A.L. Lewis Museum. We picked this day because it was supposed to open this weekend. But it just didn't happen because it wasn't time. That's the only way I can excuse it. Those who live on this beach know that for the last year and a half through COVID, I was up here pretty much 5 days a week. Then this happened and that happened. Somebody got COVID, it was just. So we decided that on this day, which is September the 5th, special. One, because we opened the American Beach Museum September 5th, 2014. Why not we open a new beginning of the museum September 5th? That 5 that I keep up is the Beach Ladies Magic. It wasn't just it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you look up what 5 means, it means freedom. It means newness. It's magic. New beginnings all come in 5, she would say. Because you know, in 1935, I was born, she would say, because she was. In 1935, American Beach was founded. And she would go on and on and on and put 5s in. When Rosa Parks first sat on the bus was 55. That was the same year. The beach lady graduated from Oberlin. She could find a 5. Voting Rights Act, and you talked about Nelson Mandela, which came to my head. He was a 5. He became the president of South Africa. 1995. As Mavi would say, now y'all see the pattern. So we had to do this on the 5th. We had to do this with the descendants. We had to do this in African tradition. We had to do this with you. So I shall step aside so that you can hear through the spirit of her great-grandfather, through the spirit of her sister, may I pause, Marvine Oshun Betch, who told Janetta and I, as we sat with her, starting from her birthday in January, where she had 5 birthday parties. Really. At every high-end place on this island, if all of y'all who were there, from the Ritz to the Omni to what's the school? To Packard, 5 birthday parties. 5. She told Janetta and I that 5, baby, and we believe everything now. 5 is how I come. 5. She made transition September 2005. May I present to you her sister, her love partner, the one who knows I know that has worked
my sisters, my brothers, my siblings all, I greet each of you. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a joy and it's certainly a privilege for me to be with you at this particular and powerful moment. To be with you as we formally rename the museum that is in many ways the creative force within our American Beach community. My sister never birthed a child. But as many of you know, she had a spiritual daughter, Carol J. Alexander. Lord have mercy. What a combination. What a mama. And Carol has already acknowledged the family, the immediate family members of the elders. But as I knew Papa, the name that the beach lady and I called him by, he would beg to differ with any notion of his family being so small. You are all, and so many more, a part of the elders' family.
All right.
But in the African tradition, in which calling of names is an act of respect and love, I want to again, Carol, call the names of his descendants in the smallest sense. Our beloved matriarch, Thelma Lewis, her daughter, Renee Lewis Glover. I'm accused of claiming her as my favorite cousin. Of course, I want to acknowledge my husband, James David Staten Jr., now known in this community as the mayor. Seated next to my husband is our son, Aaron Anthony Cole. And you've already listened to the drumming of my brother. As many of you know, for about 30 years now, John has lived in Paris and all over Europe and traveled throughout Africa and the rest of the globe. But it is here now that he is calling home.
Wow.
And so, like my husband, my brother says that Thomas Wolfe was wrong when he entitled the book, You Can't Go Home Again. We have come home. Very privileged. And I'm using that word with all its force. I am privileged to be a member of the board of what we now say is the A.L. Lewis Museum. And while our esteemed director has already introduced the board members, it is in that same African tradition out of respect and love that I greet each of you, Brother Chair, Neil Frank, my ever so special sister seated next to him, dear Secret, our sister secretary of the board, Eve, often called the soul of American Beach.
Yes.
And then, of course, Pastor Carlton who I call my brother man. If I may speak for the group, we wish to publicly say what is in the heart of each of us, and that is profound gratitude for the sterling leadership and the endless creativity of the founding and ongoing executive director and curator of the A.L. Lewis Museum, Carol J. Alexander. My sisters and my brothers, my siblings, I ask that each of you look up. I'm now asking that you look to the right of you. And if you will, look to the left of you. We affirm that each of us is a part of the American Beach community. And yes, Songbird, that includes you. Come with me now as I put words to ideas and emotions that you no doubt have and feel on this occasion. Ceremonies matter. Dates matter. Names matter. In every culture around the world, ceremonies are organized and carried out to mark joyful, solemn, important ceremonies. How well you know that we mark the birth of an individual with a ceremony we call it a birthday party. Ceremonies are held to commemorate a nation's founding. And so why not gather for the renaming of an important place in the life of our community? That is the ceremony in which we are now taking place. Yes, ceremonies matter. This ceremony is one in which we say to each other and to the world that this place, this museum has a new name. It is the A.L. Lewis Museum at American Beach. Dates matter. This morning, as you have heard, our Sister Carol so, in her way, poetically described, today we lift up two dates. The first, of course, is September 5th, 2014. The day when the imagination and creativity that was behind the work came to fruition. And this museum was officially opened September 5th, 2014. The second date, of course, is September 5th, 25. The date when Marvin Oshun Betch made her transition. A force of nature. She continues to be celebrated. The Beach Lady continues to be celebrated not simply because of her eccentricity. When you have a single lock, 7 feet long, from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet of 6 feet of height, when you have nails of that length, and when your body declares the necessity for respect for this earth and all of its people, as a force of nature celebrated not simply for her eccentricities, but for her amazing and grace-filled commitment to all life.
Yes.
And that includes the life here on American Beach and the lives represented by each of these precious young people. She will forever be honored, I pray, as a principal guardian of a place that our great-grandfather named American Beach. Names matter. For every people around the earth, they acknowledge significance through names. We African American people recall how enslavement robbed us of our African names. The disrespect and indeed the dismissal of our humanity that enslavement called for meant that when we were given names, having been robbed of our African names, they were anglicized names, like Bessie or Jacob. But always, if a last name was necessary, it dared to be the name of the very one who claimed to own us. One of the ways that we black women and men were subjected to disrespect, our humanity challenged during the era of segregation, not only here, but throughout the South, was that white folks would refer to us as Annie and Uncle. You see, names do matter. And that is why on March 29th, 1865, a couple who had been enslaved, living in Madison County, y'all know that's up the road a piece, Robert and Judy Lewis named their precious newborn son Abraham Lincoln Lewis. They named him in acknowledgement that in 1865, the year of his birth, Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation and declared our enslaved people to be free. You know, as I do through what you have read and what many of you have imagined, that A.L. Lewis was an humble yet a mighty man. He was a man of deep and abiding faith. He was a great philanthropist who believed that doing for others is just the rent you got to pay for your room on earth. He was an extraordinary man who was just one of the 7 founders of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, And of course, he was, as he used the resources of the Pension Bureau of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, the founder of American Beach. And so, my sisters, my brothers, my siblings all, how fitting it is that this museum on American Beach will now bear the name of A.L. Lewis. As I complete the circle of this talk, I want to lift up an African saying that in many ways captures why we are here this morning. It is a saying that I will often write to beloved ones who have in fact just had to say goodbye to one of their loved ones who's gone off to glory. It is an African saying with these words: as long as a person's name is called, that person never dies. Beginning today and going forward, every time each of us and countless others call the name Yale Lewis Museum, each time that is done, a declaration is made that A.L. Lewis lives. And by extension of divine power, his great-granddaughter, the Beach Lady, also lives. And yes, all of American Beach's ancestors live. Ashe.
Ashe.
Here, A.L. Lewis, come to the word.